Hello, everybody. I am going to get us started. Hello, my name is Lizzie Meister. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. I want to say good evening, good morning, good afternoon to wherever you logged in from today. So I'm from the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. We're located in New Orleans, Louisiana in the United States. And it's an honor to be able to co-host this event with the South African Jewish Museum. When Gavin Morris, the director of the South African Jewish Museum, reached out to us to discuss a possible co-hosted event, we were curious about these histories of Jewish involvement in respective rights movements, in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the civil rights movement in the Southern United States. And we wanted to think about those conversations that were there. We are museums. We think deeply about legacy and how these legacies are thought of and presented in a wider community. And so we wanted to bring this conversation to y'all. So we're thrilled to be able to bring this conversation about the legacy of activism in our respective communities through the story of two activists through their children. So our activists that we're going to be focusing on today are Harold Wolpe from South Africa and AI Botnick from the United States. Before I turn it over to Gavin, I want to also invite you to ask questions. There's a chat feature. Please pop your questions in that feature. And at the end, we'll ask our speakers these questions. Ideally, we'll get to all of them, but we'll get to some of them for sure. So with that, I want to turn it over to Gavin to get us started.
Thank you, Lizzie. Welcome, everyone. Just to concur with Lizzie's words, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to be working with the fellow Jewish Museum from right on the other side of the world. So I'm coming to you from 7 p.m. at very dark and cold Cape Town. Nick Wolpe is sitting in Johannesburg, where it's also 7 p.m. And I believe it's midday in New Orleans, where Lizzie and Michael are. So, as Lizzie said, this conversation, or this topic evolved as we were talking, and we're very lucky to have Michael, the son of AI Botnick, and Nick, the son of Harold Wolpe, here today to not only talk about their father's legacies, but also to share some of the influences and what it's meant to be a sort of a second generation activist, what it's meant to be to grow up in that type of environment. We did have an initial pre-meeting amongst the panelists earlier in the week, and conversation rolled very quickly. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting talk. I think to start us off, I'm going to ask you, Nick, just to give us about a 5-minute background into your father's history, who he was, and some highlights of his activism. And after that, Michael, I'll ask you to do the same. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and pleasure to participate in this very interesting webinar and theme. So thank you, Gavin, for giving us this opportunity. Sorry, I muted myself. Sorry about that. So I'll just say thank you again for the opportunity. So I'll give as you requested, a very kind of brief overview of my father's. Oh, it's done it again. Am I muted?
We can hear you fine, Nick.
Okay, keep muting it. So, my father was, he read a book when he was 16, which he gave to me, which influenced his whole life. That book was on what was communism. And because of that book, he became a communist, and a very dedicated communist. And in particular, dedicated to the struggle against apartheid and the grotesque nature of apartheid and what it meant. And his political activism developed at university, at Wits University. He was the president of the SRC, which was the student body. And that really was his start towards his involvement as a member of the Communist Party. He wasn't a member of the ANC because, in fact, only up until 1968, whites were not allowed to be members of the ANC, that they only were entitled to become members of the ANC after 1968. But what was interesting about the Communist Party was it was a multiracial organization. It was a multiracial body. And a lot of people joined the Communist Party because of that very nature. My father was a lawyer. His primary focus was defending political activists. So he defended people like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, and the list goes on in terms of his political activities from a legal perspective. But from a political perspective, he was a member of the leadership. He was a member of Ubuntu Asizwe, which was the military wing. In fact, he headed up military intelligence, which met at a place called Lily's Leaf Farm, which became the nerve center of the organization. And in 1960, during the roundup of political activists, he was arrested. He was then later charged under what they called the General Amendment Act, which meant that eventually he was not allowed to meet. So under the General Amendment Act and the Suppression of Communism Act. So what the apartheid state began to do was curtail the freedoms of political activists, make it much harder and harder for them to engage in political activities against the apartheid state. In 1960, the ANC was banned, along with other formations. The Communist Party had actually been banned in 1950. Following the raid on Lily's Leaf Farm, which Harold was forced to go underground because it was only going to be a matter of time before he was linked to the activities of the farm. In fact, a document was found in his handwriting at the farm, which was the code of conduct into guerrilla warfare. He had actually written it. He'd actually been involved in other things, like the drafting of the Freedom Charter and the drafting of the military strategy document called Operation Maibua. Following the raid on Lily's Leaf, it became apparent that he was going to be arrested, so he was advised to leave the country. So he went to a cousin of my mother's farm, which was in Rustenburg. And the idea was the next day he would go with him and friends of his, this gentleman, for a picnic and wander across the border. But we suspect what actually happened was this cousin led my father into a police trap and he was arrested. He was brought back from the border police station to Pretoria Central, and from there he was transferred to Marshall Square. And it was while he was at Marshall Square, he, along with 3 other comrades, hatched a plan to escape, which they eventually did. And they broke out of prison. In fact, this August will be the 60th anniversary of what has become known in South Africa as the Great Escape. And he broke out, he fled to the UK, we got political asylum in the UK, but that wasn't the end of his political activism. While in the UK, he was still a member of Ubuntu Asizwe. We discovered much later on after his death that he used to visit Angola at the military camp. He became a leading academic. He actually became the ANC's leading academic in terms of political analysis around, in particular, the relationship between class and the struggle in a nutshell. And apart from his political activities and his academic activities, he developed a program while in exile called RISA, which was the research into Southern African education. And on his return in 1991, following the unbanning of the ANC, he headed up the educational policy units around the country, which were linked to a number of the universities. He unfortunately he passed away in 1996, which was untimely because at the time, South Africa was still going through its transition and it needed the important input and contribution of critical thinkers like my father's and others. So I've tried to just, in a broad sense, give a kind of brief overview of his activities, his involvement, his political, how shall I say, indoctrination, and his future work. So I think at that point, Gavin, I will hand back to you.
Thank you, Nick. One thing some of our audience may not know is that had Harold actually gone to trial, he would have stood trial with Nelson Mandela and much of the leadership of the African National Congress, who ended up in the famous Robben Island prison. But thankfully he was able to escape, and we have Nick here with us today as a result. Michael, I'm gonna hand over to you. Maybe you can give us a bit of background into your father's history.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to share our experiences. Nick and I have had a nice, vibrant email conversation over the past week, and I think our fathers were kindred spirits in many ways, and suffered because of it. So both my parents were Ukrainian immigrants, as many Europeans were back at the turn of the century, to seek freedom and equality and escape the pogroms of Russia and the conscription of the Russian army. They came to America for opportunity and for a better life. My dad was a World War II veteran, and he witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust and everything that World War II was, especially to the Jews in Germany. And he met my mom in college there, and they settled in my mother's hometown of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. My grandfather had a schmata business, so he sold schmatas. And then during the 60s, the civil rights movement, late 50s, early 60s, the civil rights movement began, and he got involved. And I think just like Harold, both of them were brave. They had a heart, they had guts, and they wanted to see things change. My father was very influenced by the rabbi in Hattiesburg at that time, Charles Manton, who was also an activist. And my father wanted to know how to get involved. And there's an organization that many of you are aware of in America called the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, and they were looking for someone like my father, who was raised in the South. He was born in New Orleans, raised here, and knew the communities, and both the Jewish and the Christian communities well. He knew the law enforcement people. He had a lot of credibility with them. He was a historian. He was not a lawyer, as many people thought, but he also had a social outlook. So he was recruited by the ADL, and he became their director here in the South, which states included Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, which was really the battleground for the civil rights movement. At that time, the Ku Klux Klan was very active. They were fighting integration. They were trying to keep segregation in place. They did so through violence. They killed the 3 civil rights workers that came down in the 60s in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They murdered Medgar Evers. They bombed the Jewish synagogue in Jackson, Mississippi. They bombed the rabbi's house in Jackson, Mississippi. They attempted to bomb a Meridian businessman's home in Meridian, Mississippi. And my father was very active in finding out who was responsible for these bombings and bringing them to justice. And he made that his life's work. He was with the ADL for 30 years, and he made many changes, all for the better. And he passed away about the same time as Harold did in 1995 at the age of 72. But he led a full life, and I think he left his footprints in the sand.
Thank you, Michael. Nick, if I can just ask you, maybe now that we're moving on to your generation. Maybe just give us a little bit of background into your life, what you've been up to, and then we'll come to you as well, Michael, and then we'll get into the conversation.
I think, you know, what I'd like to start off by saying is one of the problems that I think that we in South Africa, and I can't talk about what in terms of in relation to children of political activists in the United States, one of the problems that we experience here is my generation and the second generation, our stories are marginalized. And I think I would like to start with that because that is a fundamental problem in terms of articulating the sort of suffering, I'd like to use, that we experience as children of political activists. And that is, you know, and it's not uniform because the children who remained in South Africa during the heyday were subjected to very harsh treatment and restriction, unlike my sisters and I and others who were exiled or living outside of South Africa. But needless to say, the important thing is that they impacted upon us. It shaped who we were to a large degree. It defined how we responded and reacted to our environment. We grew up recognizing the importance of the struggle. But in saying that, if I personalize it, I, for many years, could not fully understand it in relation to why was this struggle that was taking place 6,000 miles away, to a large degree, far more important to my father than my, call it, upbringing and interaction with it. There was always, I felt, a disconnect. It was only much later that I begin to appreciate and understand what it actually meant. But growing up at the time, it was a very traumatic and at times very hard because you were competing in many respects for his attention. You were competing against the liberation struggle. You were competing against a fight that was 6,000 miles away. And you at the same time were trying to make sense of it while recognizing that it was abhorrent, recognizing that it was evil, recognizing that apartheid was inhumane. You still were battling to kind of reconcile all of those feelings and issues with your own personal experiences as a child. And not only that, you know, you lived under a constant threat in many respects. I mean, I remember having nightmares of being kidnapped and buried alive and used as a bargaining tool against my father because, you know, while he was in exile, he was still wanted. Sabotage was still hanging over him. He was still wanted for it. He was still a marked man. We later on in the 80s discovered that there was that the house was being bugged, that we were under constant surveillance by the South African security forces. I remember on one occasion, the police came to the house and said to my father, "Are you Harold Wolpe?" And he responded by saying yes. And they said, "Could we come in?" So they came in and they said, "We have to inform you that we've uncovered an assassination hit list, which your name appears on along with Joe Slovo and others." So while we lived in kind of a sense of security, there was also this sense of fear and anxiety that perpetuated our existence because of his activity and his involvement and his, I call it the high profile nature of his activity and work in the struggle. So, you know, Gavin, it was very difficult at times. It was emotional, it was traumatic, it left its scars. I think, you know, we're still living with those scars today, and we're still trying to deal with what that impact had on us as children.
Thanks for sharing, Nick. Michael, would you like to give a little bit of perspective from your side? I think there's some parallels there with if Nick's father was on a list for assassination. I believe your father was as well. So there's definitely a parallel there. Perhaps give us a little background into your childhood.
Yes, well, there is a parallel, but it's interesting that Nick's father was obviously a very public and political figure, whereas my father worked for an agency that was very low key and worked behind the scenes and was a non-political organization, in fact, a nonprofit organization. And but because of his successful work in stopping the Klan from murdering and killing civil rights activists and attempting to kill a Jewish businessman in Meridian, my father became a target of assassination also by one of the Klan members who was eventually convicted of murder and died in jail as late as 1998, I think, or maybe even later than that. But anyway, there is definitely a parallel there. I think the approach of both was different, but it was two different political climates. I know you had asked, and I think the common thread that Nick and I have is we want to carry on our father's legacies for the next generation and generations to go forward, because hate's not going to disappear, and fighting hate is a full-time job for everybody. And bigotry, it would be a wonderful world if that weren't the case, but apparently history's proven otherwise. I know my dad instilled in me the desire to affect change, and he felt like the best way to do so was through the legal process. And that inspired me to become a lawyer and stay involved in Jewish causes and other causes that protect human rights.
Thanks, Michael. One of the things that occurs to me while I was researching both your father's histories and your own histories is the different connection to Judaism. Michael, your father was head of the ADL. It's very much an organization that's rooted in this Jewish identity and Jewish life and culture. Whereas Nick, your father was a member of the Communist Party, not particularly religious, and had a much more difficult connection to the local Jewish community in South Africa. I think it's fair to say that most of the Jews that were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, certainly those that were members of the Communist Party, were isolated from the broader community and sort of not necessarily disavowed, but certainly not embraced. Nick, maybe if you can give a little bit of perspective from that side, particularly with regards to your father's own connection to his faith and identity.
Thank you. I would actually say there was this sense of being disemboweled. I mean, my mother recalled, for example, after Harold had been arrested, she was very pertinently aware that the community provided no support. They literally kind of disappeared from view, and she felt very abandoned. And I think, why I bring that up, Gavin, does speak to a large degree to the role or the position people like my father and Joe Slovo had. Because I know for many years following the unbanning of the ANC, there's been a lot of contestation between the Jewish community on the one hand and those who were politically active on the other, in terms of how they viewed their Judaism. My father, for example, was not religious. He literally subscribed to the notion that religion was the opium of the masses. And there was no sense of Judaism in the family. There was no sense of Jewish culture to a large degree, or the history of Judaism in the family. And my mother often would raise this and say her biggest disappointment was that she did not bring up her 3 children as Jews, because she felt that we had been sort of became, I would say, nomadics. We didn't have a sense of identity. We didn't have a sense of belonging. We didn't have a sense of who we were within a broader cultural setting. Yes, we knew that we were a family of political activists, that we were, through our parents, we were involved in the struggle against apartheid. But that, to a large degree, was the extent of it. That was the extent of our understanding and our appreciation. That there was, it was very clear, how my father viewed Judaism. I mean, we never celebrated any of the Jewish holidays or any of the anything religious. It was a void that existed in our household. And I think the question that has been raised since then is, what was the impact or influence of Judaism on people like Joe Slovo, my father, Ronnie Caswell, Wolfe Kodesh, and the list goes on. And the reality was, Gavin, from their perspective, there was no influence. There was no influence of Judaism or the idea that because of being Jewish, there was a sense of justice, that we strove for justice and liberty and equality for all people. And I think that is where the debate between the Jewish community and political activists like my father was raging, and still to a large degree rages today.
Thanks, Nick. It's an unusual question. I've always found it kind of difficult to reconcile that perspective. And when you look at the people that your father used to have as friends, I mean, they're obviously all communists, but they all came from the same ethnic background. A huge proportion of those activists came from Jewish backgrounds, whether or not they, lived a Jewish lifestyle or were influenced by it. It really is an interesting sociological perspective that they were all Jews, and whether they were on a similar journey, whether it was religious or not, is another question. But there was definitely a group identity there, even if it's positioned itself outside of the established Jewish community. Michael, your childhood would have been much more involved within the Jewish community in New Orleans. Perhaps you want to give us a bit of background from your perspective.
Yes. So personally, both my parents taught Sunday school, and we celebrated the Jewish holidays, and we were given a great sense of Jewish identity, but not in a religious sense, more in a cultural sense, and more in terms of what the Jewish values taught about equality and humanity. And the immigrants that settled in the Deep South from Europe that were seeking a normal life also were seeking assimilation. And of course, part of the culture in those days was segregation. And when the civil rights movement began, it was very upsetting, I think, to the Jewish community. You see the rabbis and people like my father get involved because they didn't want any more tension between their community and the Christian community that already existed. And you have to realize that many of the Ku Klux Klanners were members of the police department, the churches. They were lawyers, they were judges. This was a secret association, so you didn't know who you were dealing with. And so my father, although he lived in New Orleans, he would travel to Mississippi to fight the Klan. And again, he did this behind the scenes and undercover. But when he showed up at Jewish meetings when they were dealing with these bombings, he was not welcomed. He was shunned. And they literally told him, "We don't need you. We don't want you. We don't want outsiders here. We can handle this on our own. And that's the way we want to handle it." So there was a lot of friction there, mainly because, these immigrants didn't want to stand out in any way. They were just looking for a normal life.
I think that's a a fair parallel with much of the South African Jewish experience. I think there was an overriding feeling of not rocking the boat, so to speak. And certainly that raised tensions with those Jews that were very high profile in the anti-apartheid movement. It's evident that both your fathers were very much called to action, that felt very strongly in their convictions. I was wondering, there's much happening in the world today. If your fathers were alive today, where do you think that this call to action would raise itself? What philosophies and what movements do you think your fathers would be very much involved with if they were alive today? Michael, perhaps you can start us off.
Well, I think the best way I can approach that is to say that when he retired, he sent out a letter to that I shared earlier with Nick and Gavin and Lizzie. And he stated that the reason he got involved was that he was moved by the belief that efforts had to be made to deal with the tragic weaknesses of the human condition. Racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, and the everyday random hatred one still finds in American life. If our system cannot work for all, then in time it will not work for any. He said that in 1992 upon his retirement. He also projected that the boundaries of human understanding would be the crucial issues of the next century, the century that we're now in. And he shared an eternal belief in the goodness of the human heart that maintains the light in our world, and that righting indignities toward any human being would be ordinary rather than the exception. Well, I think we're a long way from that, but he was certainly prophetic in his comments.
That's a very interesting question, Gavin, because I think it's also quite complex, trying to say, where would he be today and how would he view what is happening today in relation to what had happened in the past? And I think within the South African context, we cannot ignore the fact that the reality today within South Africa is that we have failed to live up to what it was the aspirations, the desires of our liberation struggle. We have failed to live up to the Freedom Charter, which Govan and Becky described as the core principle of our liberation struggle. It's a document that set out basically the aim of the liberation struggle. So when we talk about what would Harold feel about today, or how would he view today, one of the things within the South African context he would view was that we have failed in many respects to live up to the ideals for which he and many others, Nelson, Wolpe, Govan, Moses Katana, gave of their lives, gave of their commitment and dedication to bring about a free and just South Africa. I can say with confidence, he would be devastated to see that we have drifted away from those noble principles to a point today in South Africa where corruption, where theft, where I would say material greed define our country today. We've lost sight of those principles. We still live in a society where there is gross inequality, where the majority of the people don't have access to the basics, where education is lacking in many respects, where healthcare is lacking. So the list is endless. So within the South African context, he would say, we have not achieved any of the objectives to which our liberation struggle stalwart had strived to achieve, that we have failed miserably. We still are a country that to a large degree is divided by not only poverty, inequality, whether it be gender or not. But we are a country that is witnessing to a large degree a resurrection of racism, which is taking on a different form, which is both black and white. It's not defined anymore. So really, if Harold was sitting here today, his biggest concern would be the failure to achieve the objectives of the struggle for which so many gave their lives for.
So, Nick, your father passed away in 1996. It was 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He obviously was a lifelong communist. In his latter years, how did he feel about the ideology, and did he die still an avowed communist?
I mean, again, he fell out with the Communist Party in South Africa. There were differences of opinion. But yes, I think he was still a devout communist. He still believed in the principles of communism. But he was part of a very unique generation, Gavin. He was part of a unique generation that will no longer exist or will not exist in today's climate. That generation were devoutly committed to the principles. They were steadfast in what they believed in. And nothing would sway them. They held true to those ideals, regardless of circumstance, regardless of impact, regardless of consequence. And he still maintained those strong beliefs up until his death.
Nick, your one thing I think most South Africans know you for, in your own right, is that you created a wonderful museum at Lilies Leaf Farm. Now, this was the headquarters of the South African Communist Party. It's where much of the evidence was found in a raid that led to many of the arrests, including Mandela. You've obviously took on your father's legacy and your mother to a large degree as well. Your mother, let's not forget your mother here. Your mother was very much involved in the struggle as well. What did you feel you were furthering your father's legacy or his memory with your project at Lilies Leaf?
Originally, no, that wasn't why I set out to do it. My biggest and most fundamental concern was the fact that we needed to protect the history. And I'm sure Michael can relate to that, the idea of protecting one's history and one's legacy, not allowing the achievements to fade and disappear, which is something, again, I'll come back to, which we are experiencing here in South Africa today. So initially, my getting involved was not driven initially by that personal kind of perspective. It was a much broader, impersonal perspective, from the sense of saying someone needed to protect the legacy of a particular period in our liberation struggle, which will impact today and which will have defining influences on today's generation and on future generations. So no, it wasn't done originally out of a personal kind of crusade.
And Michael, you mentioned earlier that that your father inspired you to go into law. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about how you feel you've lived up to his legacy, or whether you've continued his legacy.
Well, I wouldn't presume to think that I could ever step into my father's steps. As I said, shoes, I should say. As I said before, I think both of our fathers, and I think Nick alluded to it, they were fighters, and they had heart, and they were brave, and they had guts. And it's a different world that we live in now, but I've just tried to maintain his legacy for future generations, so that they will know what the struggle is, and that the struggle is, changes all the time and it never ends. And you have to be forthright and be on the offensive to to deal with the indignities that everyday man has to deal with, the bigotry and the inequality. And look at the rise of anti-Semitism all over the world. You'd think in this day and age, especially after the Holocaust, that it would have dissipated, and it certainly has not. The world is always looking for a scapegoat to blame their problems on someone, and the Jews have always been an easy target, and so have the Black population too. So,
I'm going to open up to Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, please type it into the Q&A field or into the chat. And Lizzie and myself will have a look and make sure we get through as many questions as we can. Michael, there's a question for you from Sherry Goodman. And she says she knows that B, your father, had his address and phone unlisted and never wanted a photo taken of himself as a safety measure. Did that filter down to you when you were growing up? Were you aware of your necessity to be safe or of dangers? You're on mute at the moment, Mark.
It's a very good question. My father never discussed his work with anyone, including my mom. My mom did not know the danger that we lived in. When Byron de la Beckwith, who was a Klan member, came to assassinate my father, my mother didn't even know about it until my father was frankly coerced out of the house by his national headquarters and told him that he had to leave because he thought it was a joke. So I had no reason to think that my life was ever in danger. We were very sheltered from that. My father carried that burden himself and very rarely, if ever, discussed it with anyone other than his colleagues. So to answer your question, Sherry, no, that was never a concern of mine due to my father's sheltering me, I guess, for lack of a better word.
And the same question to you, Nick. Obviously, your father and your mother were very much involved and high profile. So when you grew up, were you ever felt at risk or felt the need to be more security conscious?
I'll answer the second part first. No, we weren't very security conscious. I think partly because of the blasé approach that my father took. I mean, again, if I recount the story about when the police came to the house to inform him that he was on an assassination hit list, I always remember one of his responses was, the South Africans aren't going to kill me because they're not going to waste a bullet on me because I'm not important enough for them to spend money on killing me. And, so that was the sort of approach that he took. Whether it was taken to protect us as a family or whether he really believed in the fact that, that they weren't going to kill him, I don't know. But the point is, we weren't security conscious. Yes, as I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, I had nightmares. My sister Tessa had nightmares. I remember talking to her about them, and she was telling me about it. I don't know whether my elder sister ever had nightmares to the extent of me and Tessa did about the kind of threat, but it was something that was there all the time. It was something that we all lived with. As you know, a number of leaders of the ANC during the 80s were assassinated. In 81, Ruth First was assassinated. In fact, my father and Joe Slovo were actually going to go and visit or meet with Ruth that morning that she was blown up. And the only reason they didn't arrive on time was because Joe Slovo was running late. Had they kept to the schedule, in all probability, they would have been in the room with her when she opened up the parcel box. So I think it's not just about my father, it's about those within the senior leadership of the ANC who had high profiles. They were always at risk. There was always going to be a potential risk of assassination. But again, as I mentioned earlier, he treated it in a very blasé manner. And I think that filtered down to the way that we behaved and reacted towards it. and took it in our stride.
Thanks, Nick. There's a question that's come in from Stephen, and it's a question that I'm quite interested in your perspective. Stephen asks how you feel about the South African Jewish community now in democratic South Africa, mythologizing the struggle Jews, in other words, trying to embrace embrace their legacy when in real terms they are very much isolated from the community at large. I know in our museum here, the South African Jewish Museum, there is a large number of the anti-apartheid struggle Jews listed in the museum. And I think if some of them were around today, perhaps they wouldn't be so keen to be listed there. Do you want to give us your perspective on that?
Well, I think, there is still, from my perspective, and I can't speak for my sisters, but from my perspective, there is disappointment. There is disappointment which is both historical and current. I mean, the historical part is what I would like to say is kind of a full acknowledgement of the fear and reluctance of the Jewish community after the Nationalist Party came to power to be more vocal. Now, in saying that, though, I do understand why, because in 1948, the nationalist government were Nazis, they were Nazi sympathizers, they had been arrested during the war for their Nazi views, and the Jewish community felt extremely vulnerable and extremely scared, and they were worried that maybe the same thing that happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany could happen to them in South Africa, given the ideology and the politics of the nationalist government. But in saying that, though, I think the lack of silence throughout the years thereafter was a problem, was very difficult, because, the Jewish community, there were members of the Jewish community who were major sympathizers and supporters of the nationalist government. Percy Utah, for example, the prosecutor at the Ravonia trial, Jewish. I'm not saying that it was the vast majority, but I think today there needs to be a reevaluation of the role and the reaction of the Jewish community during that period from 1948 to 1990, and explore, the much broader issues about the impact that had on the activists themselves, because they were themselves ostracized. Like I mentioned, my mother felt extremely ostracized after the raid on Lily Stephen, after Harold had been in prison.
Thanks, Nick. Michael, there's a question for you from Michael Klein. He'd like to know about your father. How much did you know about your father's work? I mean, did you really find out most of this after his retirement, when he felt a bit more secure to share, or as you grew older, were you much more aware of the type of work he was doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I touched on it earlier, but I'll elaborate a little more. He shouldered all this himself, without really disclosing it to any of the family members, at least until I got older, and when I went to law school in the 70s. So beginning in the mid 70s, obviously the assassination attempt was in 1973, and that was a very public event. The Byron de la Beckwith was tried on many charges, and so there was, once that became public, then obviously I became a lot more aware of the information, but most of the time I was sheltered from it when I was growing up, basically during my teenage years and college years. I don't think that my dad wanted us to carry any burden or be concerned about the work that he was doing. And of course, the nature of it was very delicate, because you were dealing with very violent people, and he didn't want to expose his family to that violence. And again, it was much different than Harold, who was a much more public figure. My father was not a public figure at all. He worked completely behind the scenes and undercover.
Thanks, Michael. I see Laurie has raised her hand, so I'm going to allow you to ask your question yourself, Laurie. Are you there? You're on mute at the moment. Laurie Fireman? Okay, we'll go on to, we can come back to. So there's a question that's come in from Debbie. And I think it would be best maybe if you guys respond to this in your own right, not necessarily projecting onto your fathers, but what are your feelings towards the rise in anti-Semitism amongst the Black community that we're seeing over recent times, both here in South Africa and as well in the US? Michael, maybe you can give us your perspective first.
Well, it's disconcerting, but I don't think it's fair to make a blanket statement that the entire Black community is anti-Semitic. It's certainly not the case. There are many Black leaders who give a lot of credit to the Jewish community for being involved in the civil rights movement. I think that people like Louis Farrakhan give the Black community a very bad name. And unfortunately, in our social media conscious world, they get more attention than the leaders of other very viable civil rights organizations that give the Jews all the credit that they're due.
Nick, do you want to maybe give us a bit of your opinion from a South African perspective?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think in addressing this question, it must be seen in a kind of the unique South African political context, because I don't want to single out the Black community by saying, yes, there has been a rise in anti-Semitism. We acknowledge there has been. There have been comments made by leaders of the ANC, which have been interpreted as anti-Semitic and are anti-Semitic. But again, I must stress and reiterate, it must be seen within the broader context because of the rise, there is racial prejudice between the Black community and the Indian community, between the Indian community and the colored community, and the colored community, the Black community. So the South African context is slightly different in the sense of that we live in a society that has been characterized in many respects for the last 300 years, and like the same with the United States, by racial prejudice. And we're experiencing it today. And we cannot ignore it, but we also must accept that this is also something that is linked to the legacy of apartheid and the impact of apartheid.
Audrey Klein, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question? Audrey, are you with us? Okay.
Gavin, do you have your settings on where everybody's muted? Maybe they're not being able to unmute.
Okay, I'm going to just ask to unmute. Okay, folks, I'm working in a museum for a reason, because I'm not terribly technologically inclined. So please rather just type your questions if you have any into the chat. I think that makes it a little bit easier. Michael, Laurie Botnick Fireman. I'm making an assumption she's related to you and may have a question. Or Laurie, you should be able to speak. There we go. We can hear you.
Okay. I just wanted to add something to what my brother said. Although my father sheltered us so that we wouldn't have the anxieties, etc., I was the only child still living at home when we were asked to vacate our home. And I was about, I think, 13 or 14 years old. And I remember not being scared, not being anxious, because I had total trust in my father to protect me. So I just wanted to add that comment. I mean, he had no choice but to tell me what was going on. And of course, he told my brother and sister as well. But I felt very safe, even though it was a very kind of scary situation.
Thank you, Audrey. It's amazing how much weight people put in their fathers to protect them. I think it's a natural natural feeling. Audrey, I see your hand is up. Let's see if you can join us. Audrey Klein. You're winning? No. Okay, we'll come back. We'll come back to Audrey. I am conscious that we're getting towards the end of time, but coming from somebody who runs a museum, and Lizzie, I'm sure you can appreciate this as well. Lily's Leaf Farm, which Nick started, which was a wonderful museum and resource in Johannesburg, has faced tremendous challenges lately. Nick, maybe you could just give us a bit of insight into what's happening there at the moment, as
Actually,
much as you are aware.
Yeah. Before I go into that, I saw that Harry Nate had a question about my mother, and I think it's actually very important that I talk about the women of the struggle within this context as well, because we ignore their roles, we ignore their important contribution and the role that they played and what they suffered. In many respects, they suffered more and harsher penalties than the men did. And I think that's something, that we need to highlight. And for example, my mother, as I mentioned, she was ostracized. She felt isolated. She felt alone. She had no support after the raid on Lily's Leaf. And I think that's something that has been forgotten as we address, the role and the importance that the men play. We must remember the role that the women played and how much they suffered. And, Hilda Bernstein, my mother, and other Jewish women, and how they were also ostracized, isolated, imprisoned, and subjected to the same brutality as the men, if not worse. I mean, interestingly, I was engaging with the Mandela daughters, and we were talking about how, one of the biggest traumas that the women faced was the fact that they were separated from their children. And that's something that we've never really looked at. Yes, I've touched upon it in a very peripheral way by talking about the experiences of my sisters and myself, but I just would like to bring that up. Now, coming back to the main question that you asked, unfortunately, Lily's Leaf today is a shadow of what it was before the COVID pandemic. And it is a site that has unfortunately disintegrated. It's no longer the site that it was, again, prior to the pandemic. But it's, again, I would like to broaden it and focus on a much broader thing by saying this is symptomatic with how our government in South Africa treat the importance of historical sites across the board. Our historical sites are neglected. Our historical sites are not given the due respect that they are required, the due respect of ensuring that the importance of the past is not forgotten. And it's something which I'm sure resonates very strongly with the audience here, given how the Holocaust is still very much part of the discourse and very much part of the discussion today that it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago. In South Africa, the role of historical sites, the impact that historical sites had, and the role that they played in the struggle have no place in South African society today. Our focus is not on the history of this country, unfortunately. It is on other issues which have now come to dominate the social political landscape.
I think that's a very good note to finish on, because really a lot of what we've been talking about here is the importance of legacy and of heritage and of keeping memory alive. I want to thank Michael and Nick for giving up their time and sharing their perspectives, and Lizzie for a lot of the heavy lifting and organization work done by the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. Those of you who are here in South Africa, I urge you, when you are next in the US, to go to New Orleans and have a look. And similarly, if you are in the US and planning a trip down to South Africa, come have a look at the South African Jewish Museum. It'll be our pleasure to meet you. Michael, do you have any closing words?
No, I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to share our stories. And it was wonderful to hear Nick's family struggles, which are quite incredible. And I think it's important. That's what museums are for, and is to remember the past so that we can plan for the future. And I want to thank both Gavin and Lizzie for their efforts in putting this together.
Our pleasure, Michael. Nick, any closing words?
Well, really just to reiterate what Michael said, I mean, it was a delight and an absolute pleasure listening to what Michael had to say and share regarding his family's experience, particularly his father, and just to thank both Lizzie and yourself for putting on this event to allow both of us to share with the audience these stories, which have an important role to play in helping us meet the challenges that we're currently facing today. So thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add, Gavin, I'm sure you're going to say this, but just to be before you sign off, that there's a lot of people I got emails from that couldn't log on. If you'll remind everybody that this has been recorded and you're going to share the link so that we can send it to all those people that either came on late or couldn't get on at all.
Absolutely, you're quite right, Michael. This will be cleaned up and put onto YouTube. It'll be on the South African Jewish Museum's YouTube site by early morning your time tomorrow. And it will also be on the MSJE site, YouTube site, or on your website as well, Lizzie. Lizzie, would you like to say a few words before we go?
Just thank you. I think everybody has covered the importance of this conversation. So thank you all for your time, and especially to Gavin for getting this all together.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. For those of you on a Sunday night, and those the rest of you who are at a Sunday lunch, enjoy the rest of your day. Please be sure to check our respective museum websites and Facebook pages and social media for upcoming events. And thank you to our two panelists. It's been most informative. I think we've created a friendship between the two of you that I'm sure will go on beyond this call. Have a lovely evening and afternoon, everybody, or afternoon. Keep well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.